Welcome to another episode of Food and Cooking 101, and in today's episode we're going to be making the classic American dessert Strawberry Shortcake. And Strawberry Shortcake is pretty much just a flaky biscuit stuffed with sweetened strawberries and whipped cream. It's one of the easiest desserts you'll ever make, and it's one of my favorites as well. So with that, let's get to it. So to get started, I've got a 1-pound package of fresh strawberries, and the first step is to remove the top section containing the leaves. And I try not to cut too far into the strawberries, but I do like to make sure that the little core which held the leaves in place is removed. And after this, you've got a couple of different options for getting these things ready. One would be to cut them down into slices, and the other one would be what I'm doing here, which is to cut the strawberries into quartered sections. And I kind of like the look of these little wedges, so this is usually what I go with. And the next step is to add 1/3 of a cup of sugar along with a pinch of salt to the strawberries. Then give them a good mixing either by hand or with a utensil, and make sure that the salt and sugar are mixed well and evenly distributed throughout. And when you do strawberries like this, they're referred to as macerated strawberries. So these things are ready to go into the refrigerator right now, and you want to let them sit there for about an hour to draw out excess moisture, break down the cell structure, and soften them up. And you could definitely use frozen berries if you want to for this. And the really cool thing about using frozen berries in strawberry shortcakes is that the freezing process actually breaks through the cell structure and they're soft already. So all you have to do with those is mix them with sugar and a little bit of salt and they're good to go. So into the refrigerator we go, and with that, let's get our dough ready. For the biscuit dough, I've got 8 ounces of all-purpose flour, 4 ounces of butter, 6 ounces of buttermilk, a teaspoon of baking powder, a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda, 2 tablespoons of sugar, a 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla extract, and about a 1/2 lemon worth of lemon zest. So start by combining all of the dry ingredients into the bowl containing the flour, then mix everything together thoroughly to make sure all of these ingredients are evenly dispersed. Then drop in the butter, and you want to make sure that the butter is cold because you don't want it to melt or blend in too much. It's important to leave the butter in chunks because what happens during baking is that the butter melts and the melted butter spreads out and creates pockets, and these pockets can trap steam, and this is how you get a flaky consistency in pie doughs and biscuit doughs. And I prefer using a pastry blender for this, but if you don't have one of those, a fork will also work well. And as you're mixing, your fork or whatever blending utensil you're using might get a little clumped up, so you might have to unclump it a few times while working this through. And again, when you're finished up with this, you're looking for the butter to be barely worked in with this, and the pieces should be somewhere in the size range of frozen peas or hazelnuts. And I think this is looking pretty good here, so with that we can add the liquid ingredients, being the buttermilk, vanilla extract, and I also added the lemon zest in this stage as well. And once you work in these ingredients, you want to briefly mix it in the bowl first before unloading it onto your countertop. It's much less messy when you allow some of the liquid to become incorporated first. And when you do decide to empty everything out of the bowl, it's going to be a very shaggy mixture at first, and it might seem like it's not going to come together into a smooth dough, but if you work it for about 30 seconds or so, it will come together. And it's important to briefly knead this mixture anyway, because developing a small amount of gluten will also contribute to the flaky consistency that we're going for. And there is kind of a fine line between that and overdoing it as well. Generally, I go for roughly 20 to 30 seconds after the dough comes together. And after kneading the dough, you can cut or shape the biscuits any which way you want. I'm choosing to sort of unceremoniously mold it into a rectangle and cut them into squares, which is actually quite difficult to do by hand, but honestly, I've never really been concerned about getting perfectly shaped biscuits. They're going to taste great either way. So the term shortcake itself is partially misleading and partially accurate at the same time, because obviously we didn't make a cake today, we made biscuit dough. Now the term short does apply because in the galaxy of baking and pastry, terms like short, shortening, and shortened are used to describe any fat and the effects that they have to pastries that they're added into. Because what fats do is that they inhibit gluten development through lubrication, or they shorten the dough. And you may have also heard the term short dough thrown around, and those are typically used to make tarts and tartlets. They're used to make tart tatans, Linzer tarts, Swiss apple tarts, and so on. And those tart doughs are generally made by this method, except for the fact that those contain eggs and they don't contain leavening agents like the baking powder that I added to this one. Okay, jumping back in with our biscuits, it's time to get them cut out and panned up. And I forgot to mention that biscuits generally double in height when baking, so keep that in mind when shaping out the dough beforehand. I usually prefer my biscuits to be between an inch and 1.5 inches in height, so I'm aiming for the dough to be somewhere in the range of a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch before I start cutting them out. And another little tidbit to point out here is that if you want the biscuits to come together as they bake, space them apart 1/2 of an inch away from each other on the pan, and as they grow and expand, you'll get those steamy pull-apart biscuits. And one more optional step here, which I think is a good one, is to lightly brush the tops with a little bit of melted butter. This helps develop that perfect golden brown crust on top. And with that, these things are ready to go into a preheated 425-degree oven for 15 to 18 minutes. And if you did this right, they should come out of the oven looking something like this: tender, flaky, and golden brown on top. And these need to rest for a few minutes, so let's jump back over to the prep station and get our whipped cream ready. And for that, combine 4 ounces of heavy whipping cream with 2 tablespoons of powdered sugar and a tiny splash of vanilla extract. Then grab your whisk and whisk it all together for a few minutes, or until the cream forms stiff peaks when you take the whisk out of the bowl. And I should point out that whipping cream does go from a perfect stage of stiff peaks and a smooth consistency to grainy and curdly looking fairly quickly, so it's not a bad idea to take your foot off the gas a little bit when you're getting close to it being done. And this is looking pretty good right here, so with that, let's check back in on the strawberries from earlier. You can see that they've softened up and released some of their moisture, so with that, I think we can get this thing plated up. Start by splitting a biscuit in half, and you can usually do this by just breaking it apart by hand, but a knife will also work. Then set the bottom half onto the center of the plate, and follow that up with a few hefty spoonfuls of our strawberries. Then top off the strawberries with a good portion of our sweetened whipped cream, and finally gently place the top of the biscuit over the whipped cream, making sure not to smash it down. And with that, we've reached the end of the video, so as always, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.